Hello, welcome to LPW706. I'm Dr. Carolyn Beasley, and today I'll be talking with Associate Professor Dominique Hecq about subjectivity. Welcome, Dominique.
Thank you.
So, Dominique, what is subjectivity?
What is subjectivity?
It's a hard question.
It's a very hard question. One way of putting it is the self, or theories about the self, really. And there are many theories about the self. As you know, since the linguistic turn last century, people have been talking about the self in all kinds of ways.
Yep. And how does that relate to the writerly self?
Because if you think about it, your writerly self is really the persona with which you write. So it's like inhabiting a different character, and that character comes with a baggage which is full of experiences, but can also be full of little quotations from other people. That's one way of putting it in a nutshell.
Okay. So I guess when we're journaling, which is the assessment for LPW706, we get to play around with the notion of writerly identity and of subjectivity, and we get to test out various voices as ourselves, with ourselves as writers and as our characters. What are the sorts of ways we can do that by playing around with subjectivity?
I think you can play with what the deconstructionists called subjective positions.
Ooh, okay.
That is
technical.
Simple way of
might need to explain that one for me.
Yeah, you imagine yourself, or you ghost yourself into the body and mind of, for instance, somebody of the other gender or of a different race, although this might be a little bit tricky, person from a different class, different culture, and so forth. So you try to embody different characters. That's a nice little playful activity.
Fantastic. So if I was writing about if I had a male character, I could, and you use the term ghost. Is that, so I can imagine that I'm walking in their shoes and analyse any experiences that they might be having in the novel in terms of how I might feel or how they might feel. How does that, is that
That's
the way it works?
Exactly what it is, and it also, the ghosting is my way of putting it, but it also encompasses the concept of voice. So how this person would talk, for instance, what his little tics would be, or because the voice in point of fact translates the way you think and what you think about. So yes, it's all of these things.
Fantastic. Yeah. Very interesting. And of course, in the wonderful lecture that you've written, you've talked about many different perspectives of subjectivity, such as Lacanian and Freudian. If I were to write in my journal, or to pull apart an experience that my character's having in a journal, could I play with that from a Freudian perspective and then Lacanian perspective? How could I kind of use those perspectives in my journal?
Absolutely. I talk as though I'm an authority about this, but I'm not. Nobody's
an
authority about subjectivity. The secret is to read lots of theory or lots of writings by Lacan, say, and then you'll see what their little obsessions are. So Lacan would talk about desire, for instance, or he would talk about the imaginary and the real, and so forth. So you could deconstruct your character in those terms. But there are other ways of thinking about this. Lacan's big idea is the divided subject. So you could think of a character who's got a schizophrenic kind of makeup, and play with that idea, a person who is always in two minds, so does one thing and does actually think something else. Freudians would probably be easy. They probably would write up a lot of dreams. And if you don't like Freud, you can go to Jung and interpret then those dreams in Jungian symbols. These are ways of going about it. If your theorist of choice is Sixtu or Kristeva, for instance, you would take a much more sexualized approach to your character, and probably play off one gender against another, or write from the perspective of a child. For instance, if you are into Kristeva, who talked about quite a lot about the semiotic, and I touched a little bit about on the Cora in the lecture. Yes, so I don't know.
Fantastic. And I think one thing that's come up from this particular conversation, which relates back to the previous lecture, is the idea of play, in that you can use your journal entries and your journal overall as a space to play with how a particular character, or and I'm using the idea of fiction, but you might be, if you're writing non-fiction, you still may have characters in there. You're still dealing with people. If they're real, you can still project fictional techniques on them and keep them real. But the idea that you can layer over those characters a particular reaction, just to test out how they would react in a Lacanian way, and then work out whether or not that can be used as a way of showing how they're pitched against the world, or perhaps if you were looking at the idea of Derrida's difference, we were talking about that earlier, the idea that perhaps a person's reactions to the world is mediated by a kind of language space. So perhaps the way they think, or what they think, and what they say to the outside world is different. So you've got this fantastic opportunity to play with tension in a character, to let the reader know that that something's amiss, that things are going to go bad because this character is thinking one thing and saying or doing another. So looking at the different perspectives of subjectivity lets you play around and get new ideas about how to manage those scenes.
And the idea, the notion of play is extremely important, and I would bring another theorist, that's Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst, who wrote a book called Playing and Reality, and he talks about the transitional space, which is the space between the baby and the mother. It is that actually the creative space as such, and that's a good way of viewing your journal. It's your playground. Yeah, I use another term when I talk about my journal, because my journal sometimes a bit more stodgy than a playground. It's like a studio. I don't write in the first person. I feel very uncomfortable with doing that in my journal, for instance. Or if I do, I fictionalize things immediately. So it's a kind of defense mechanism. But there are many ways of writing a journal, as I'm sure you've covered. But yeah, it's a good way of seeing it as a playground.
And I like to just pick up that idea of writing in the third person as a way of distancing yourself from what you're writing about. If you're writing perhaps a trauma novel, or writing a scene where a character is going through something very difficult and very emotionally draining for you to write, because you have to project into them, or possibly because you've lived that experience yourself and you're trying to represent that on the page. The journal becomes a space where you can use these different approaches of subjectivity to protect yourself from emotional harm about when you're writing about these experiences.
It's a good point. It's the point that Glenys makes in her lecture, and it's the point that I'm going to make in the very last lecture of this module, because I talk about just this taking your distance from your material to protect yourself, but also to protect your reader. Things that may be too confronting for the reader are difficult things to write about, so it's quite important to take that into account.
Absolutely. And what about the idea of intertextuality? Now, this is a Barthesian term. Roland Barthes came up with this. Is also a term quite well used in media studies. But what is intertextuality?
It's actually Barthes' PhD student who quoted the term intertextuality. It's Kristeva, when she was Barthes' student in the 60s. The concept of intertextuality means that, you know, we are little magpies. We take quotations from what other people, from other writers, but also as fiction writers know from people who live around you. I mean, you sometimes take conversations down and so forth. So intertextuality means that the self and any text, and the text, the self may be seen as a text, is just a layering of different quotations. And it's a constant work in progress. It's not finished.
So as writers writing and recording and gathering for our journal, we may be inspired by a line in a film that we've seen, or an artwork, a dream, or as we said, a conversation. I heard this fantastic conversation when I was sitting in an emergency room once. A child was quite hyperactive, and her grandfather said, "Oh, all right then, go on, lick the walls," which was just a beautiful kind of expression of freedom, yet chastising as well. And that line always stuck with me, so I sort of wrote a story from that. So the idea that you can draw inspiration from different sources, but also that you can apply them in a mishmash way with other sources in your journal in an intertextual way. And that whilst, for instance, that example that I've just given you, I may then use later on in a song or in a film script. So it becomes, it's not a static moment in your journal. It can interact with other things. And of course, as we, Dominique and I will in the next lecture be talking about creativity, but intertextuality is quite an essential part of creativity as well. In that we're eternally being inspired and absorbed and fascinated by things around us, and we apply those to other things around us. We make a leap from one idea to another, and so that's, for me, is very much an intertextual context or an intertextual idea. Yeah, that's wonderful. So what sort of activities might we build into a journal, or can we do to play around with the idea of subjectivity?
As I was saying at the beginning, it's changed subject positions. So ghosting yourself into a different person, into inanimate objects. Even just think of yourself as a text. Or you can also react against, this plethora of theories about subjectivity. There is at the moment a return to humanism and a return to feelings. A return to a more phenomenological approach to the self, which is more holistic. Not everybody feels comfortable with being all over the place all the time, and there is a return to this sense of a more solid sense of self, which is emerging from studies that are being currently done in the neurosciences. I mean, Antonio Damasio is probably one of the main figures, or was, because the research is already out of date, as I speak.
Fantastic. So how does that apply in a practical way if we're thinking about a return to emotion? Can you tell us a bit more about that? Like, is that how might we show that in a character change if we're moving away from, well, you talked about unifying and people don't necessarily want to be all over the place.
Yes. I'm talking from the point of view of the academic or the theorist, but of course fiction writers have known that all along. I mean, we play with the five senses, and it's one way of of not divorcing your body from the way you feel and the way you think. I mean, that's probably what I mean by that.
Yep, absolutely.
And the return to emotion is in the world of theory, and how people are theorizing subjectivity, arguing that babies feel from the moment they are born, which is something that is not rocket science, but it had been overlooked until people like Damasio wrote about it.
Fantastic. And I really love what you said about writing from the point of view of an inanimate object. And this is something that we may not feel comfortable doing straight away, but when you think of some fantastic novels that have done that, or authors that have done that, such as Joanne Harris in Blue Blackberry Wine, where she wrote from the perspective of a wine bottle. It was beautiful, or of a wine that had been bottled. So she was looking at narrating what happened around her, but also her history as a grape and how she moved on. And it was just a lovely way of, I guess, of sitting in the subjective space by commenting on everything that's going around you, but without having to live it at the same time. It was a very interesting distancing device. Can you think of any other works that have used that idea of the inanimate object?
Well, poets do it all the time, and of course the concept of negative capability that was put forward by John Keats, the poet, the romantic poet, is at the root of this concept. I suppose it's a beautiful phrase, but that's basically what he meant. Put yourself into the shoes of something else. I know of novels, but people have written from the point of view of animals, and it's one way of stretching your imagination, I guess.
Yes, Paul Auster has written a novel from the point of view of a dog, I think, as well, one of his works.
And Virginia Woolf. I don't know whether you've read Flush, but it's a delightful little book.
Oh, really? No, I've read some of hers, not that one. There you go, pointer. Wonderful. All right, was there anything else that we feel we should talk about in terms of subjectivity? I mean, we've talked about what it is, so we want to recap the idea of what it is for our students.
I think that if you want to experiment with, putting yourself into some other shoes, one key term is respect, because you have to respect difference. It's one thing appropriating it, but you have to do it with respect for the other.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dominique.
My
that was
pleasure.
really enlightening. Thank you.